you launch. What were the kind of biggest lessons in the first 12 months?
The biggest lessons was that we very much listened to the audience. So the way that we viewed it was every piece of content was like an experiment, and we needed to take note of every experiment that went out there. So the first 6 to 12 months, or certainly the first few years, there's a lot of learning, figuring out if we post content around this topic, are people going to be interested in that? So we shifted and hired people and changed trajectory on where we were going many times based on feedback from people. So an example is when Junkee first launched. Originally, it was called Junkee because it was about being a pop culture junkie. So it was about being, as hooked into pop culture. And then the whole Tony Abbott thing happened that I explained earlier, about 6 months into it. And all of a sudden, we dialed down some of our entertainment content and dialed up our politics content because we saw that was a real big focus for us. So there's been a constant seesawing with limited resources.
Again, was that back to research? Was there analytics? Was it interviews? Was it just gut in? What was driving that evolution?
Yeah, it's a combination of art and science. So every year we did the annual research study, which was really important. We were glued to ChartBeat. So ChartBeat to us, so the ability to see live data, and ChartBeat was new once again at the time. This concept of having live analytics of who's on your website, and the more that you saw that, and we took cues from big publishers overseas, and we had like a giant leaderboard up on the side of the office with live data of who's reading what story, and would hook ChartBeat into our veins basically to kind of understand what happened when you publish content. Did people stay around for a long time? What stories had staying power? So ChartBeat for all of us became probably the most important piece of technology because it allowed us to just really understand live analytics and who's consuming what on the website. And the more you stared at it, the more you logged into it at 10 o'clock at night and at 4 in the morning and at midday, the more you would understand, oh, that's interesting. That content seems to have a shelf life of half a day. It's a bit like, sugar. It kind of like gives you a short burst and then it goes. Whereas this content here, it might be SEO content. It could be long form content. This content here has a longer shelf life, and that's better to invest our time and energy into.
Right. So ChartBeat became your addiction.
Yeah.
How did you see that evolve, the kind of operating model of kind of content creation, i.e., from a world of sort of set and forget content creation to one where there's constant iteration? It sounds like something you probably pioneered then at Junkee.
Very much so. Yeah, there was every piece of content. The aim was to try and get better at creating the content, at crafting it, at figuring out the headlines that would work for the audience. We would have Slack channels where you would have to workshop headlines before kind of putting them up based on experience of what worked in the past, or based on a bit of data versus a bit of science to try and make the content better and more clickable. We always kind of thought that content that didn't have an engaging headline, just because of the way that the audience discovered most of our content, which was through seeing a headline on Facebook or seeing it on Twitter or seeing it in an email newsletter. If you didn't give a piece of content the best chance of someone actually reading it, you kind of just almost wasting a piece of content if the headline isn't engaging enough. We also lived through the era of Upworthy and things like that, where Upworthy kind of pioneered this concept of like the curiosity gap and kind of clickbait headlines. And I think we all kind of went on journeys from clickbait to clickable. And we used to make sure that our headlines were clickable, that they weren't clickbait.
And in that journey in parallel, I'd love some insight into culture. I think there's a misnomer that culture in companies in media companies or any sort of company, it doesn't matter until you get to a particular size. And I think anyone who's worked in a startup knows as soon as you've got two people in the room, you've got culture. How did you define, maintain, evolve the culture for Junkee Media?
Yeah, it was a real constant challenge. It was a real constant effort, because essentially in most media companies you do have two types of cultures. You've generally got a sales culture and you've got an editorial culture. And generally, once again, this is stereotypically, the two cultures are quite different.
Indeed.
Because different sorts of people are attracted to them. And we were a smallish company, so there was 50, 60 staff. So we're all in one office. It wasn't like we're on different floors. It wasn't like you could have two different cultures. So to me, that clash of the cultures where you have sales, which were generally loud, out of the office a lot, revenue focused, growth focused, generally extroverts, and then editorial people who were often the opposite of that, needed silence in order to kind of think through stories, generally bordered on introverts, appreciated, editorial over revenue. And to me, that clash of those two cultures was kind of part of the fun and the tension and the magic that I think makes media companies work. Sitting at the top of that, myself and Neil and a bunch of others would often have to wear both hats. And the best editorial people, once you rise to the top, are people that really understand how editorial works, but then also understand the revenue realities. And balancing the two of those is a really fascinating skill for every editorial person to learn. So that tension between those two parts of the culture was always what made it so interesting. Sometimes really bloody hard. Often you'd have to umpire and kind of, stop the two sides of the family from fighting, that separation between church and state. But I loved that. I loved the tension between that. I thought it was really healthy tension.
As someone who, from what I can see, grew up with that passion and expertise in content, how did you get your head around the commercial component and the ability to sort of intertwine the two?
Yeah, I drew a lot on my early days in advertising agencies, as a way of understanding the reality of creativity for sale, for want of a better term, of kind of like the way that advertising agencies work, of dealing with clients and balancing clients' needs with your own needs. For me, it was something that I'd spent my whole career trying to figure out. How can you balance between those two sides of making sure that you have editorial integrity, but then also that you are making money and that you are paying people's wages. For me, I think as soon as I went too far one way or the other, I was generally brought back in line, sometimes by the editorial team, kind of reminding me of why I got into this, and sometimes by the realities of the revenue team of seeing if we didn't have any revenue next quarter, we'd have to make some staff redundant. And so that, I think that walking that fine line was something that I am still learning, have always learnt. But I think it's probably the one thing that makes media so interesting and so exciting, is that the truly great media companies are able to walk those fine lines. And I look at things like, look at something like the New York Times or something like Vox, which I look a lot at. They've been able to maintain both editorial integrity and also massive growth. And those two things are, if you're able to do both of those, you do pretty well.
If you were able to, through a time portal, go back and talk to the, I guess, 2010, 2011, 2012 version of yourself, what would be the kind of 3 tips you'd give yourself?
Oh, what a big question. I would say a couple of things. I think one would be kind of like to have faith in the process or the vision that you have. A lot of things change in the media industry. So social media comes and goes, competition comes and goes, Revenue comes and goes, staff members kind of come and go. But if you have real faith in where you are going and what that vision is, I think maybe understanding there's always going to be kind of ups and downs, but trying to let them, to ride them out better so they become a little bit less dicey. Number two would be do the research, but then I think gut is almost as important as kind of research and data side of things. If you, one without the other is probably a mistake. If you just do research and trust and believe that what people tell you in a survey is gospel, you're probably going to get into trouble. Whereas if you just go there all with gut and without any research, that's also a mistake. And the third one would probably be to write more. I think just like not forget what really got me into this in the first place, which is I loved writing, and it took me 10 years of not writing and kind of, you know, got caught up in managing people and doing all of that and not giving a chance to kind of reconnect with that. It was only towards the end of my time at Junkee that I sat down and wrote my first book, Cult Status. And now I've rediscovered writing so much that I do it every day. And that's kind of what I did in my early 20s. I wrote every day, sometimes for myself, sometimes for feature articles, sometimes for books. And I kind of like, I lost that a bit in the middle of all of the drama of running a company.
Right. I mean, it sounds like you loved running the company, but there is this kind of special do what you love core to you that you've been able to not just rediscover, but make pretty successful. So
yeah, I loved Junkee, but I was just gonna say I loved Junkee, but it was hectic. It's hectic when you're in the middle of a storm. It's the most exciting thing in the world. It is the most fun thing in the world. But it's also really hectic, and it is you're part of like a whirlwind that goes on. And there's moments where I miss that, and there's moments where I thank God that that's over. And I think that's kind of like the, you know, why running a media company is so enticing and enthralling, and why I would recommend that anyone, if they're given half the opportunity to do that, should do that. It is one of the best and craziest times of your life.
It's probably a good segue to the kind of final question in the cohort. And I guess, you know, generally it's great that I think we're seeing more and more media innovations. Some of them are on a mission to be, you know, big scalable businesses, but some of them I describe as being organizations that are serving underserved communities and are just looking for repeatability. You're not going back in a time machine. You're just meeting some of these founders. And it's up to you how many and what you pick. But advice for somebody starting off today as a founder in media or news media.
Yeah, I think a couple of things. Number one is that a great mission is wonderful, but it needs to be sustainable. So you need to figure out what your revenue model is, and there needs to be a revenue model, because people will only do volunteer work or passion work for as long as the passion lies within them, or until something else will eventually take their attention. I think the biggest, or one of the worst revenue models is advertising. It is obviously the easy one for people to understand, and it should be part of your mix, but not the sole part of your mix. I think anything you can figure out outside of that, whether that is events, whether that is, by the time we sold Junkee Media, about half our revenue came from Junkee Studio, which was a agency that we had, where we did white label social media work for brands like Netflix and Westpac and Qantas. And that, to me, helped Junkee Media survive and thrive and grow, because we had another revenue model outside of advertising. So I really think long and hard around what the revenue model is. I think also make sure that you are having fun in doing this whole thing, because it can be really stressful. It can be daunting. And if you're not having fun doing it, there's other things in your life that you can do to get some fun or enjoyment out of. So I think find your revenue model, don't make it advertising, and have fun.
Amazing. Super wise words. Really, really brilliant to be talking to you, and thank you for finding the time. It's been awesome.